Why Kastrup's Analytic Idealism Fails. Written by Felipe Bautista. To attempt to extract from a purely arbitrary idea the existence of an object corresponding to it is a quite unnatural procedure and a mere innovation of scholastic subtlety. Immanuel Kant. The aim of the present writing is to make clear in what sense Kastrupian analytic idealism inevitably is groundless, and inevitably is a case of dogmatic metaphysics. Mr. Bernardo Kastrup's analytic idealism insists on the transcendental reality of an alleged mind at large and its alleged alters referring to other minds, such that I and all possible minds are excitations of one absolute mind at large. Incidentally, under no circumstances can Mr. Kastrup insist on the empirical reality of a mind at large or other minds. Neither a mind at large nor other minds can be given in a possible experience. Experience affords access only to immanent appearances, and appearances are immanent representations in me, such that Mr. Kastrup, insofar as he does insist on the reality of a mind at large and other minds, a mind at large and its alters, implies the transcendental reality of such, or says nothing meaningful at all. Now, Kastrupian analytic idealism is inescapably groundless specifically because it is dogmatic metaphysics. Dogmatism entails the presumption that it is possible to make progress with pure knowledge, according to principles, from concepts alone. Because neither a mind at large nor other minds can be given in a possible experience, eo ipso, reason has access only to the concepts of a mind at large and other minds. And because Kastrupian analytic idealism insists on the transcendental reality of a mind at large and other minds from concepts alone, it would entail blatant absurdity to insist on the empirical reality of a mind at large or other minds because experience allows access only to immanent representations. Eo ipso, Kastrupian analytic idealism inescapably is dogmatism. Kastrupian analytic idealism is a case of pre-critical dogmatic building castles in the air, a case of pre-critical illegitimately inferring existence given only essence. Kastrupian analytic idealism is inescapably groundless because it entails building castles in the air, but it is also inescapably groundless because the transcendental reality of a mind at large and other minds cannot possibly be sufficiently substantiated a priori or a posteriori. The transcendental reality of a mind at large and other minds cannot possibly be sufficiently substantiated a priori, because it is not logically necessary that a mind at large and other minds have transcendental reality, and because it is logically possible that solipsism or egoism is actually the case. Additionally, the transcendental reality of mind at large and other minds cannot possibly be sufficiently substantiated a posteriori, because experience affords access only to immanent appearances, and appearances are representations in me. Further, because it is logically possible that solipsism is actually the case, it is not logically necessary that representations in me have any necessary connection to any alleged transcendental reality. It is logically possible that solipsism is actually the case, such that it is logically possible that there is no transcendental reality at all. Additionally, Mr. Kastrup cannot even in principle appeal to experience at all in an attempt to defend his metaphysical idealism. As concerns the sources of metaphysical cognition, its very concept implies that they cannot be empirical. Its principles, including not only its maxims but its basic notions, must never be derived from experience. It must not be physical, but metaphysical knowledge, viz., knowledge lying beyond experience. It can therefore have for its basis neither external experience, which is the source of physics proper, nor internal, which is the basis of empirical psychology. It is therefore a priori knowledge, coming from pure understanding and pure reason. Needless to say, Mr. Kastrup's analytic idealism entails apostasis. It involves treating the abstract concept of a mind at large and its alleged alters as if it had concrete transcendental reality, even when neither a mind at large nor its alleged alters can ever be given in concreto in a possible experience. It commits the classical metaphysical error of treating abstract concepts as if they possessed concrete reality. The chief stumbling block of Kastrupian analytic idealism is that it presupposes what it should really explain, namely, the transcendental reality of a mind at large and other minds. Although the transcendental reality of mind at large and other minds cannot possibly be sufficiently substantiated a priori or a posteriori, meaning that the real chief stumbling block of Kastrupian analytic idealism is that it necessarily must be groundless. Kastrupian analytic idealism simply assumes the transcendental reality of a mind at large and other minds, and then explains the variety of empirical phenomena from this assumption. But the fundamental problem is the actual transcendental reality of such a mind at large and other minds in the first place. Kastrupian analytic idealism is a petitio principii. Kastrupian analytic idealism begs the question by presupposing the transcendental reality of a mind at large and its alleged alters, without firstly showing how the transcendental reality of such a mind at large and other minds is either necessary, apodeictic, or actual, assertoric. To say nothing of the fact that the transcendental reality of a mind at large and its alleged alters cannot possibly be shown to be necessary, cannot possibly be sufficiently substantiated a priori, and cannot possibly be shown to be actual, cannot possibly be sufficiently substantiated a posteriori, such that Kastrupian analytic idealism inescapably is problematic. This reveals Kastrup's position as trapped in an inescapable bind. It must presuppose what it cannot possibly prove. Yet what it presupposes is precisely what most requires proof. This is not a minor logical flaw that can be corrected through better argumentation. It represents a fundamental and necessary failure of analytic idealism. Dr. Samuel Johnson famously appealed to the stone in an attempt to show, against Berkeley's subjective idealism, the transcendental reality of mind-independent matter. But, of course, Johnson's appeal to the stone inevitably fails, because Berkeley does not deny that there is the perception of stones or pain. Berkeley only denies the transcendental reality of sensible qualities, which transcendental reality Johnson's appeal to the stone egregiously fails to establish. In the same way, Kastrupian analytic idealism entails an appeal to the stone against solipsism. Kastrup insists that, on the basis of apparent intersubjective agreement, there is an objective world out there, beyond our individual minds. The solipsist does not deny that there is the appearance of intersubjective agreement, and appearances are representations in me. He only either denies dogmatic solipsism or doubts problematic solipsism, the transcendental reality of other minds or a mind at large. Appealing to the stone against solipsism, Kastrup tells us that there is an objective world out there, beyond our individual minds, because of the appearance of intersubjective agreement. But, of course, appealing to apparent intersubjective agreement, appearances are immanent representations in me. An attempt to defend the transcendental reality of mind at large or other minds is, besides begging the question, a blatant appeal to the stone against solipsism. The solipsist, whether he is a dogmatic or problematic solipsist, does not deny the immanent apparent intersubjective agreement that Kastrup is appealing to. The solipsist only denies dogmatic solipsism or doubts problematic solipsism, the transcendental reality of mind at large or other minds that Kastrup cannot possibly sufficiently substantiate a priori or a posteriori. Kastrup makes the same category error as Johnson. He attempts to refute a position which either denies or doubts transcendental reality, dogmatic and problematic solipsism respectively, by appealing to immanent representations, when the very question at issue is the relationship between these immanent representations and any purported transcendental reality. Not only does Kastrup's system begin by assuming what it needs to prove, but what it needs to prove is, by its very nature, impossible to prove sufficiently, a priori, or a posteriori. Analytic idealism thus reveals itself as doubly flawed. It both begs the question, and the question it begs is one that cannot be answered within the constraints of possible knowledge. Of course, just because the transcendental reality of a mind at large or other minds cannot possibly be sufficiently substantiated a priori or a posteriori, it does not follow that one cannot uphold the regulative validity of the idea of other minds on the basis of practical reason. While the pre-critical dogmatist like Kastrup may get caught up in what Kant called transcendental illusion, and illegitimately confuse what can only ever be regulative ideas for constitutive. The mature critical philosopher will be aware that knowledge is limited to experience, and that the ideas of reason, including the Kastrupian idea of a mind at large, function as regulative principles that guide our inquiry, but cannot provide constitutive knowledge. As Kant noted in his third critique, teleological judgments about ends have regulative validity only, such that, although one may think of apparent living beings acting volitionally for ends, it does not necessarily follow that they therefore really do so. The distinction between regulative and constitutive principles is precisely what distinguishes critical from pre-critical philosophy, and Kastrup's failure to grasp this distinction places him squarely in the pre-critical camp. Kastrup may appeal to the stone all he pleases, but no amount of appealing to imminent apparent intersubjective agreement will ever be sufficient to substantiate his metaphysical claim of the transcendental reality of mind at large or other minds. To say nothing of the fact that not only can Mr. Kastrup not at all appeal to experience in defense of his metaphysical idealism, for, as concerns the sources of metaphysical cognition, its very concept implies that they cannot be empirical, but the transcendental reality of mind at large and other minds cannot even possibly be sufficiently substantiated a priori or a posteriori to begin with. Kastrupian analytic idealism inescapably is groundless, and inescapably is pre-critical dogmatism. Because Mr. Kastrup's approach is pre-critical dogmatism, he does not comprehend that apparent intersubjective agreement is nothing more than a set of representations in me. And because Mr. Kastrup's approach is pre-critical dogmatism, he hypostatizes outer appearances. In addition to dogmatically treating the abstract concept of a mind at large and its alleged alters as if it had concrete transcendental reality, when he dogmatically affirms that there is an objective world out there beyond our individual minds. Namely, we hypostatize outer appearances when we come to regard them not as representations, but as things existing by themselves outside us, with the same quality as that with which they exist in us. Kastrup begs the question when he pronounces that there is an objective world out there, beyond our individual minds, and an appeal to the stone cannot possibly suffice to substantiate this petitio principii, a fact of which Kastrup lamentably seems unaware. Hence, why his analytic idealism begins with begging the question and appeals to the stone. Incidentally, as remarked David Hume in his treatise of human nature, to begin with the senses, 'tis evident these faculties are incapable of giving rise to the notion of the continued existence of their objects after they no longer appear to the senses, for that is a contradiction in terms, and supposes that the senses continue to operate, even after they have ceased all manner of operation. And, as Hume wrote in his first inquiry, it is a question of fact whether the perceptions of the senses be produced by external objects resembling them. How shall this question be determined? By experience surely, as all other questions of a like nature. But here experience is, and must be, entirely silent. The mind has never anything present to it but the perceptions, and cannot possibly reach any experience of their connection with objects. The supposition of such a connection is, therefore, without any foundation in reasoning. That Kastrupian analytic idealism is pre-critical dogmatism, and without any foundation in reasoning, is incontestable. The mind has never anything present to it but the perceptions, and cannot possibly reach any experience of their connection with objects. Eo ipso, Kastrupian analytic idealism must necessarily be groundless dogmatism, and without any foundation in reasoning. Kastrup's attempt to establish the transcendental reality of a mind at large and other minds, through appeals to experience, is doomed from the start, as experience can never reach beyond perceptions to establish such connections. As wrote Arthur Collier in his Clavis Universalis, whether the seeming, that is, empirical externeity of a visible object be indeed an argument of its real, that is, transcendental externeity, I leave to be proved by all those who will affirm it. Mr. Kastrup's appeal to seeming intersubjective agreement commits the same category error as Johnson's kicking of the stone. Just as Johnson failed to understand that Berkeley was not denying the sensation of stones, but, rather, their mind-independent existence, Mr. Kastrup fails to understand that the appearance of intersubjectivity within consciousness does not establish the transcendental reality of other minds beyond consciousness. Both appeals to the Stone, Kastrups, and Johnsons mistake the presence of appearances within experience for proof of something beyond experience. Collier's challenge, that those who would argue from empirical to transcendental externity must prove this connection, remains unanswered by Kastrup's appeal to imminent apparent intersubjective agreement. Just as Johnson's foot striking the stone could only demonstrate the presence of certain sensations within experience, rather than any transcendental claims about mind-independent matter, Kastrup's appeal to apparent intersubjective agreement can only demonstrate the presence of certain patterns within experience, rather than any transcendental claims about minds beyond individual consciousness. This reveals a deeper pattern in pre-critical metaphysical thinking, the persistent tendency to mistake features within experience for proofs about what lies beyond experience. When Kastrup points to apparent intersubjective agreement as evidence for his metaphysical claims, he repeats Johnson's error in an equally fallacious form. Both Johnson and Kastrup fail to recognize that no accumulation of evidence within experience can establish claims about transcendental reality, as such claims require precisely the kind of jump from empirical to transcendental reality that Kant showed to be illegitimate. Incidentally, it is ironic that Mr. Kastrup, in his The Idea of the World, argues against the reality of physically objective matter, on the grounds that physically objective matter is not an observable fact, but a conceptual explanatory device abstracted from the patterns and regularities of observable facts, that is, an explanatory abstraction, adding further that there seems to be a growing tendency in science today to mistake explanatory abstraction for what is available to us empirically. It is ironic that Mr. Kastrup writes this way because, given the fact that neither a mind at large nor other minds can be given in a possible experience, experience enables access only to immanent representations. The Kastrupian mind at large and its alleged alters, other minds, amounts inevitably to not an observable fact, but a conceptual explanatory device abstracted from the patterns and regularities of observable facts, that is, an explanatory abstraction. Kastrupian analytic idealism, ironically, does not avoid the growing tendency in science today to mistake explanatory abstraction for what is available to us empirically. And what is available to us empirically is immanent representations only. Rather, analytic idealism is a paradigmatic case of that very tendency. If we apply Kastrup's own criteria consistently, his posited mind at large and its alters fall prey to exactly the same criticism he levels against physical materialism. Both mind at large and its alleged alters are unobservable explanatory abstractions derived from patterns in experience. Yet, Kastrup seemingly fails to recognize that his critique of materialism applies with equal force to his own metaphysical explanatory abstractions. Furthermore, matter at least has empirical reality, even if we doubt matter's transcendental reality, whereas neither mind at large nor other minds can possibly have empirical reality. And the transcendental reality of mind at large and other minds cannot possibly be sufficiently substantiated a priori or a posteriori. The transcendental idealist may admit the existence of matter without going outside his mere self-consciousness or assuming anything more than the certainty of his representations. That is, the cogito, ergo sum, for he considers this matter, and even its inner possibility, to be appearance merely. And appearance, if separated from our sensibility, is nothing. Matter is with him, therefore, only a species of representations, intuition, which are called external, not as standing in relation to objects in themselves external, but because they relate perceptions to the space in which all things are external to one another, while yet the space itself is in us. This asymmetry reveals another fundamental weakness in Kastrup's position. Kastrup's criticism of materialism fails to recognize that matter, understood properly through transcendental idealism, has a legitimate status as empirical appearance that his own metaphysical explanatory abstractions lack. The mind at large and its alleged alters cannot claim even the modest epistemic status, empirical reality, that matter can claim within a critical framework. because experience entails only my immanent representations, and because a transcendent mind at large and its alleged alters cannot possibly be my immanent representations. Eo ipso, Kastrup's position is more problematic than the materialism he criticizes, not less. Kastrup's explanatory abstractions lack both empirical reality and demonstrable transcendental reality, whereas matter at least possesses the former. And Kastrup cannot even appeal to immanent apparent intersubjectivity in defense of his analytic idealism. This would be to appeal to the stone, because his analytic idealism requires the transcendental reality of a mind at large and its alters. Kastrup cannot appeal to immanent representations in attempt to defend his hypothesis of transcendental reality without thereby appealing to the stone. Any appeal to apparent intersubjectivity to establish the transcendental reality of mind at large and its alters represents a basic confusion between two distinct orders of reality. Any appeal to immanent appearances, including apparent intersubjectivity, in defense of claims about transcendental reality, inevitably constitutes an appeal to the stone. It attempts to bridge an unbridgeable gap between representations within consciousness and claims about reality beyond consciousness. Kastrup's attempt to ground transcendental claims about mind at large and its alters in immanent appearances represents precisely the kind of category error that critical philosophy was designed to prevent. The gap between immanent representations and transcendental reality cannot be bridged by any accumulation of empirical evidence, making Kastrup's appeals to apparent intersubjective agreement fundamentally misguided. This reveals a deeper problem in Kastrup's philosophical methodology. While he recognizes the dangers of reifying explanatory abstractions when critiquing materialism, he fails to apply this same critical scrutiny to his own metaphysical explanatory abstractions. This selective application of critical standards undermines the coherence of his entire metaphysical project. All objections can be divided into dogmatic, critical, and skeptical, tells us Kant in his first critique. A dogmatic objection is directed against a proposition, a critical objection against the proof of a proposition. A skeptical objection sets assertion and counter-assertion in mutual opposition to each other, as having equal weight, treating each in turn as dogma and the other as the objection thereto. It should be clear that our objection to Mr. Kastrup's analytic idealism is a critical one, namely, confines itself to pointing out that in the making of the assertion, something has been presupposed that is void and merely fictitious, and it thus overthrows the theory by removing its alleged foundation without claiming to establish anything that bears directly upon the constitution of the object. In other words, endeavoring to avoid dogmatism, unlike as in Mr. Kastrup's clumsy pre-critical dogmatic approach. We are not here to make any equally dogmatic claims either affirming or denying the transcendental reality of our own proposed transcendent entities or processes. We are not even here to dogmatically affirm or deny that metaphysical solipsism is actually the case. Rather, we aim only to show that Mr. Kastrup's analytic idealism is without foundation. And it is without foundation. This is not opinion. Critical philosophy is practically a foreign language, not only to the laity, but even, as Mr. Kastrup's analytic idealism lamentably proves, to professional philosophers. Only the critical philosopher will comprehend that knowledge cannot possibly go beyond the bathos of experience. In turn, the dogmatist, for instance, Mr. Kastrup, will fall into transcendental illusion by which metaphysics has hitherto been deceived, leading to the childish endeavor of catching at bubbles. Appearance, as long as it is employed in experience, produces truth, but the moment it transgresses the bounds of experience, and consequently becomes transcendent, produces nothing but illusion. And that Mr. Kastrup's analytic idealism is, besides blatant pre-critical dogmatism, a case of egregious transcendental illusion, is beyond dispute. The fundamental insight of critical philosophy, that knowledge cannot possibly extend beyond the bathos of experience, remains poorly understood or actively resisted by dogmatic approaches like Kastrup's analytic idealism. And though we may readily forgive the layman for poorly understanding this insight of the critical philosophy, since the layman, being untrained in philosophy, by definition does not know any better and is eo ipso honestly innocent. The failure to comprehend this insight is significantly less pardonable and outright tragic in the case of a professional philosopher. But, since Mr. Kastrup's approach is essentially one of dogmatism, we need not be surprised here. As a philosopher, Mr. Kastrup should be intimately familiar with Kant's critical turn and its decisive demonstration of the limits of human knowledge. Mr. Kastrup's failure to observe the boundaries of legitimate philosophical inquiry and his reversion to pre-critical dogmatism represents not mere ignorance, but a fundamental failure of philosophical responsibility. What makes this particularly tragic is that Mr. Kastrup, as a professional philosopher, has presumably encountered these critical arguments, yet either failed to truly understand them or chosen to ignore their implications. Mr. Kastrup's analytic idealism thus represents not an innocent misunderstanding, but a regression to precisely the kind of dogmatic metaphysics that Kant showed to be philosophically untenable. The fact that Mr. Kastrup's approach is essentially dogmatic explains this failure, but does not excuse it. Kastrup's appeal to apparent immanent intersubjective agreement in attempt to defend his transcendental realism reveals a deep internal contradiction in his method. He needs to establish something about transcendental reality, namely, the existence of mind at large and its alters, but his argumentative strategy can only ever establish facts about immanent appearances. This is not merely a weakness in his argument. It represents a fundamental impossibility in his project. No amount of evidence from within the sphere of immanent representations can ever establish the transcendental claims his system requires. His appeal to apparent intersubjectivity thus represents not just a failed argument, but an impossible argumentative strategy. The problem here goes beyond mere logical error. It reveals how Kastrup's entire approach to metaphysics remains trapped in pre-critical thinking, unable to properly distinguish between claims about appearances and claims about transcendental reality. This confusion leads him to attempt impossible argumentative moves, trying to establish transcendental reality claims through evidence that can only ever speak to immanent appearances, immanent representations. In potential counterargument, the Kastrupian may protest that consciousness is directly given in experience. However, such counterargument entails ignoratio elenchi. We do not argue against the reality of consciousness. We only point out that the affirmation of the transcendental reality of a mind at large and other minds is dogmatic metaphysics and unavoidably groundless. The transcendental reality of a mind at large and other minds is a necessarily groundless affirmation, because the transcendental reality of a mind at large and its alleged alters cannot possibly be sufficiently substantiated a priori or a posteriori. Not a priori, because it is not logically necessary that a mind at large and other minds have transcendental reality, and because it is logically possible that solipsism is actually the case, and not a posteriori, because experience affords access only to immanent representations. Further, in potential counterargument, the Kastrupian may protest that the mind at large hypothesis provides the best explanation for the hard problem of consciousness and the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. Yet, if one wants to appeal to best explanations, then one must land upon outright solipsism. Because solipsism does not multiply entities beyond necessity. Occam's razor. In fact, as we have seen above, it is not necessary to postulate the transcendental reality of a mind at large or other minds. It is not logically necessary that a mind at large or other minds have transcendental reality, and it is logically possible that solipsism is actually the case, such that Kastrupian analytic idealism actually does multiply entities beyond necessity. Furthermore, explanatory power does not entail ontological truth. Existence does not follow given only essence. Additionally, in potential counterargument, the Kastrupian may protest that solipsism does not sufficiently account for the apparent order and regularity of my experience, nor does solipsism explain the apparently autonomous activity of apparent other organisms. This counterargument, however, begs the question by presupposing a transcendental reality. presupposing that the apparent order and regularity of my experience and the apparently autonomous activity of apparent other organisms depends on some affection from a transcendental reality, when it is perfectly logically possible that both the apparent order and regularity of my experience and the apparently autonomous activity of apparent other organisms involves nothing more than immanent representations in me and arises exclusively from the energy of the mind itself, e.g., as in dream episodes. It is logically possible that solipsism is actually the case, so that such a potential Kastrupian counterargument appeals to the stone and begs the question against solipsism. Such a potential Kastrupian counterargument takes for granted the transcendental reality which is now in question, petitio principii, and remember, an appeal to the stone cannot possibly be a sufficient defense of a petitio principii. Because Mr. Kastrup's approach is pre-critical dogmatism, he does not comprehend that apparent intersubjective agreement, like all appearances, is nothing more than a set of representations in me. Also, in potential counterargument, the Kastrupian may protest that Kastrupian metaphysics is grounded in empirical observations about the nature of consciousness. However, besides the fact that Mr. Kastrup's analytic idealism cannot possibly be sufficiently substantiated a priori or a posteriori, as we have seen above, Mr. Kastrup cannot even in principle appeal to experience at all in defense of his metaphysics. As concerns the sources of metaphysical cognition, its very concept implies that they cannot be empirical. Its principles, including not only its maxims but its basic notions, must never be derived from experience. It must not be physical, but metaphysical knowledge, viz., knowledge lying beyond experience. It can therefore have for its basis neither external experience, which is the source of physics proper, nor internal, which is the basis of empirical psychology. It is therefore a priori knowledge, coming from pure understanding and pure reason. Also, Kastrup may attempt to defend his analytic idealism by pointing out that, while the materialist makes a substantial leap of faith in postulating the transcendental reality of mind-independent matter and other minds, the Kastrupian makes a relatively smaller leap of faith in postulating only a universal consciousness and its alters, other minds. But it is precisely this small leap of faith that eo ipso renders Kastrup's analytic idealism a species of Jacobian irrationalism, a Jacobian salto mortale, blatant irrational fideism, and eo ipso the contrary of rational criticism. For Kastrup to insist that his analytic idealism entails a small leap of faith, even if it is a smaller leap of faith than the one made by the materialist, is for him to tacitly admit that his analytic idealism egregiously is a case of irrationalism, and eo ipso of dogmatism. The fact that Kastrup's leap might be smaller than the materialist's leap does nothing to rescue analytic idealism from the realm of irrationalism. A smaller irrational leap is still fundamentally irrational. The irony here is striking. In potentially attempting to defend his position by minimizing the size of its required leap of faith, Kastrup would actually confirm one of the key criticisms made against his analytic idealism here, that his system represents a regression to pre-critical thinking. Whether the leap of faith is large or small becomes irrelevant once we recognize that any such leap represents an abandonment of critical philosophical standards in favor of dogmatic assertion. Now, Kastrup may insist that his postulation of a mind at large and its alters entails not an irrational leap of faith, but reasonable inference, parsimonious explanation, and a necessary starting point. Yet, as we have seen, Kastrup's affirmation of the transcendental reality of a mind at large and its alters is not a reasonable inference, because it is actually a petitio principii and an argumentum ad lapidem, namely, actually is fallacious, is not parsimonious because it entails a violation of Occam's razor, and posits an unnecessary transcendental reality which it cannot possibly substantiate a priori or a posteriori. And, anyway, explanatory power does not entail ontological truth. Existence does not follow given only essence, and does not involve any necessary starting point, because it multiplies entities beyond necessity. It is simply not logically necessary that a mind at large or other minds have transcendental reality. and to argue for the empirical reality of such is absurd, because experience allows access only to immanent representations in me. Kastrup's analytic idealism cannot escape its fundamental groundlessness by appealing to either rationality or faith. The attempt to defend it through appeals to empirical observation, minimal faith commitments, or reasonable inference each fails in its own way, while collectively demonstrating the inherent impossibility of establishing the kind of dogmatic transcendental claims analytic idealism requires. Also, the Kastrupian may insist that his analytic idealism is based not on reason, not on faith, but on revelation. But revelation is always a mode of experience, and experience entails only appearances, and appearances are representations in me, such that, once again, the Kastrupian would be begging the question and appealing to the stone here. The appeal to revelation, thus, represents another variation of the stone-kicking argument. It mistakes the presence of certain representations within consciousness, in this case, revelatory experiences, for proof of something beyond consciousness. This merely reproduces the fundamental error of trying to bridge the unbridgeable gap between immanent appearances and transcendental reality. Whether the experience is ordinary or extraordinary, mundane or mystical, it remains bound by the fundamental limitation that experience can only provide access to representations in consciousness, not to transcendental reality beyond consciousness. Worse, such a question-begging and stone-kicking appeal to revelation only reinforces the dogmatic ways of Kastrupian analytic idealism, which dogmatic ways are, indeed, not within the intention of the natural constitution of our reason, and inasmuch as they have their source in misunderstanding, it is the duty of philosophy to counteract their deceptive influence, no matter what prized and cherished dreams may have to be disowned. The appeal to revelation represents not an escape from dogmatism, but rather its intensification, attempting to establish through appeal to special experience what cannot possibly be established through any experience whatsoever. Dogmatic speculative metaphysics like Kastrup's can have for its basis neither external experience, which is the source of physics proper, nor internal, which is the basis of empirical psychology. But, worse, the appeal to revelation would only entail dogmatic irrational fideism once again, because the Kastrupian would be tacitly taking it upon faith, besides begging the question and appealing to the stone against egoism, that immanent representations have a relation to an alleged transcendental reality, when it is precisely this relation which is in question, and which is not even sufficiently demonstrable a priori or a posteriori to begin with, to say nothing of the fact that the Kastrupian, being dogmatic and pre-critical, would be illegitimately extending the category of relation beyond its proper sphere within experience. The Kastrupian may additionally attempt to defend analytic idealism by counter-arguing, but that which is all-containing and without limits is absolute unity, and involves the concept of a single being that is likewise the supreme being. Accordingly, we conclude that the supreme being, as primordial ground of all things, must exist by absolute necessity. Namely, the Kastrupian may counter-argue that the reality of finite consciousness presupposes the necessary transcendental reality of universal consciousness. However, such potential Kastrupian counter-argument begs the question against solipsism and takes for granted that I am a finite consciousness, when it is logically possible that I am no such finite consciousness. Namely, said potential counterargument presupposes the transcendental reality of a universal consciousness, even when it is logically possible that the metaphysical solipsist is right. And, not only is there no transcendental reality of any kind at all, to begin with the senses, 'tis evident these faculties are incapable of giving rise to the notion of the continued existence of their objects after they no longer appear to the senses. For that is a contradiction in terms, and supposes that the senses continue to operate even after they have ceased all manner of operation. But I myself, not as something empirical, e.g., contingently apparently man, or contingently apparently butterfly, Zhuangzi, but as a mind issuing representations to, for, by, and as itself. Subject-object identity implied in as itself, am the sole existent, qua mind issuing representations to, for, by, and as itself. such that the objects of the senses actually have no continued existence at all after they no longer appear to the senses. Qua mind that only happens to be, for lack of a better term, contingently dreaming itself now man, although it may, without contradiction, suddenly begin to contingently dream itself in a butterfly situation, such that the objects of the senses actually have no continued existence at all after they no longer appear. Namely, it is logically possible that the metaphysical egoist is right, and I, qua mind and not qua some contingent empirical situation, e.g., qua apparently man, qua apparently butterfly, etc., am all-containing and without limits, such that the objects of the senses actually have no continued existence at all after they no longer appear, such that there actually is no transcendental reality of any kind at all. Namely, it is logically possible that I, qua eternal mind dreaming itself in, and as, various contingent empirical situations, there being no transcendental reality of any kind at all in this case, am primordial ground of all things, such that there is no transcendental reality at all. The Castrupian, in the counterargument now being discussed, only begs the question against the metaphysical egoist, and presupposes the transcendental reality the egoist either denies, dogmatic egoism, or doubts, problematic egoism. Of course, the dogmatic egoist, like the Castrupian, engages in blatant dogmatism. After all, it is logically possible that a universal consciousness does have transcendental reality. Nevertheless, the concept of an absolutely necessary being is a concept of pure reason. That is, a mere idea, the objective reality of which is very far from being proved by the fact that reason requires it. Under no circumstances is essence ever sufficient to justify us in concluding existence. Furthermore, the Castrupian, insofar as he counterargues this way, violates Occam's razor by multiplying entities beyond necessity, because the metaphysical egoist can likewise conclude that the Supreme Being as primordial ground of all things must exist by absolute necessity, without going outside his own given existence. Namely, to conclude that the Supreme Being as primordial ground of all things must exist by absolute necessity does not at all necessarily require the postulation of any transcendental reality, and is perfectly compatible with metaphysical egoism. After all, it is logically possible that all that exists is myself, qua mind without beginning or end, dreaming itself in finite empirical situations, and it is logically possible that there is no transcendental reality whatsoever at all, objects being annihilated when they no longer appear, and recreated anew only when the mind reconstructs them again as immanent representations. Incidentally, remember to insist that solipsism does not sufficiently account for the apparent order and regularity of my experience, nor does solipsism explain the apparently autonomous activity of apparent other organisms, entails begging the question. Namely, entails presupposing a transcendental reality, presupposing that the apparent order and regularity of my experience, and the apparently autonomous activity of apparent other organisms, depends on some affection from a transcendental reality. Although what is in question here is transcendental reality to begin with, when it is perfectly logically possible that both the apparent order and regularity of my experience and the apparently autonomous activity of apparent other organisms involves nothing more than immanent representations in me and arises exclusively from the energy of the mind itself, and when it is perfectly logically possible that the objects of the senses actually have no continued existence at all after they no longer appear. The mind that dreams itself now man, now butterfly, need not be grounded in any larger consciousness. It could itself be the ground of these appearances, with objects having no continued existence beyond their appearance in consciousness. It is logically possible that I am an eternal mind dreaming itself in an infinite series of contingent empirical situations, such that it is not logically necessary to postulate any transcendental reality of any kind to legitimately conclude that the Supreme Being, I, qua eternal dreaming mind, dreaming contingent dreams, as primordial ground of all things, must exist by absolute necessity, Such attempted Kastrupian counterargument thus reveals itself as another instance of pre-critical thinking that fails to recognize the limitations of transcendental arguments and the permanent logical possibility of solipsism. It demonstrates how Kastrup's position continues to rely on question-begging assumptions about the transcendental reality it presupposes but cannot possibly sufficiently substantiate a priori or a posteriori. To be clear, we do not insist that the dogmatic egoist is right. We only point out that the possibility of egoism being actually the case is sufficient to render analytic idealism inescapably groundless and a case of dogmatism, just as much as dogmatic egoism is dogmatism. Even if the problematic egoist is, in turn, a benefactor of human reason insofar as he compels us, even in the smallest advances of ordinary experience, to keep on the watch, lest we consider as a well-earned possession what we perhaps obtain only illegitimately. A single consciousness, myself, not qua some contingent empirical situation, but qua mind that issues representations to, for, by, and as itself, logically could be the ground of varying empirical appearances without requiring any transcendental reality beyond itself. This sufficiently demonstrates that the Kastrupians' attempted necessity counterargument fails, because it cannot exclude this logical possibility, and begs the question and appeals to the stone against this possibility. As Hume noted, we cannot derive the notion of continued existence from the senses themselves. This opens the logical possibility that I, qua eternal dreaming mind, could be the source of all appearances without requiring any larger consciousness or transcendental reality. It is logically possible that every representation arising in me, whether a perception, an idea, a belief, a hypothesis, a conviction, a philosophical ideology, a feeling, a theory, etc., arises exclusively by the energy of the mind itself, such that there actually is no transcendental reality whatsoever at all, such that the objects of the senses have no continued existence when they no longer appear as representations in me. And this logical possibility cannot be ruled out by Kastrupian begging the question or Kastrupian appeals to the stone, as even theories and convictions amount to representations in me, including the theory or conviction of a transcendental reality. The potential Kastrupian necessity counterargument thus reveals itself as another instance of pre-critical thinking that mistakes conceptual necessity for transcendental reality. It demonstrates how Kastrup's position continues to rely on question-begging assumptions about transcendental reality that cannot be sufficiently substantiated either a priori or a posteriori, while violating Occam's razor by multiplying entities beyond necessity. The concept of a supreme being is in many respects a very useful idea, but just because it is a mere idea, it is altogether incapable, by itself alone, of enlarging our knowledge in regard to what exists. It is not even competent to enlighten us as to the possibility of any existence beyond that which is known in and through experience. A concept is always possible if it is not self-contradictory. This is the logical criterion of possibility, and by it the object of the concept is distinguishable from the nihil negativum. But it may nonetheless be an empty concept, unless the objective reality of the synthesis through which the concept is generated has been specifically proved, and such proof, as we have shown above, rests on principles of possible experience, and not on the principle of analysis, the law of contradiction. This is a warning against arguing directly from the logical possibility of concepts to the real possibility of things. Nor can the Kastrupian justifiably counterargue that I, qua mind issuing representations to and as itself, require some transcendental reality beyond myself to which I am related, or by whose dissociation activity I am caused, since such counterargument would entail a transcendent application of the categories of the understanding, especially of relation, illegitimately extending the categories beyond their rightful use within experience, and applying these to some hypothetical transcendental reality, a transcendental reality which, worse, is not even logically necessary to begin with, given that metaphysical solipsism is logically possible, regardless of how much one begs the question or appeals to the stone against it. The categories of understanding are tools for organizing experience, not ladders to climb beyond it. Even if such transcendent application of the categories were legitimate, which it is not, the Castrupian counterargument would still fail because it cannot establish the logical necessity of its conclusions. The permanent logical possibility of solipsism means that no amount of category-based reasoning can establish the necessity of a transcendental reality beyond one mind, myself, issuing representations to itself. The attempted counterargument thus fails on two levels. First, by illegitimately extending categories beyond their proper domain of application, and second, by failing to establish the logical necessity of its conclusions, even if such extension were permitted. This represents a double transgression of critical philosophical boundaries, both in the misuse of categories and in the attempt to establish necessity where none can be demonstrated. This reveals another aspect of how Kastrup's position remains trapped in precritical thinking, attempting to use the tools of understanding to build metaphysical castles in the air, rather than recognizing the proper limits of their application. The very attempt to explain consciousness through relation to, or causation by, transcendental reality demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of the legitimate scope of these concepts. Furthermore, Mr. Kastrup's analytic idealism actually involves precritical synthetic a priori judgments, so that the name analytic idealism is not necessarily even warranted. The analysis of one's experience reveals the transcendental ideality of space and time, and how the categories of the understanding determine one's thinking about appearances. The analysis of one's experience does not, however, reveal that a mind at large, or other minds, must necessarily have constitutive transcendental reality. Ironically, Kastrup's so-called analytic idealism presupposes the transcendental reality of a mind at large and its alters, and then attempts to explain the phenomena from this not possibly verifiable presupposed transcendent universal consciousness, whereas all existential propositions are synthetic. Whatever, therefore, and however much our concept of an object may contain, we must go outside it if we are to ascribe existence to the object. Speculative reason can never show solipsism to be a logical impossibility, and solipsism always remains a logical possibility, regardless of how much speculative reason is applied. The skeptic always has legitimate grounds to doubt the transcendental reality of other minds or mind at large. Furthermore, because experience allows access only to immanent representations, solipsism cannot possibly be sufficiently refuted a posteriori. To appeal to appearances in attempt to refute solipsism would be only to appeal to the stone. Mr. Kastrup does not analyze experience so much as he adds dogmatically to experience, via the synthetic a priori postulation of the not logically necessary transcendental reality of mind at large and other minds. Mr. Kastrup's analytic idealism is an egregious case of precritical speculative or dogmatic metaphysics. Were Mr. Kastrup to actually analyze experience, he would indubitably discover that knowledge cannot possibly go beyond experience. He would indubitably discover that the postulation of the constitutive transcendental reality of mind at large and other minds entails transcendental illusion and blatant pre-critical dogmatism. Furthermore, Mr. Kastrup, were he to actually analyze experience instead of reveling in pre-critical synthetic a priori propositions, that is, instead of engaging in pre-critical building castles in the air, would incontestably discover that, though speculative reason cannot possibly rule out solipsism as a logical possibility, practical necessity, or practical reason, justifies only regulative, not constitutive, claims. Nor can Kastrup insist on the mere regulative validity of the mind at large. A regulative principle is in no position to dissociate into alters, such that Kastrupian analytic idealism is dogmatic, or nothing at all. It is clear that Kastrupian analytic idealism entails a consistent failure to recognize the limits of what can be legitimately claimed based on experience, combined with a tendency to mistake explanatory abstraction for metaphysical truth. This pattern exemplifies precisely the kind of pre-critical thinking that Kant's critical philosophy was designed to overcome. Kastrup's reversion to pre-critical dogmatism thus represents not mere ignorance, but a fundamental failure of philosophical responsibility. Mr. Kastrup's analytic idealism is necessarily groundless, not because it has merely been poorly argued, but because it essentially requires establishing what cannot possibly be established within the bounds of legitimate philosophical inquiry. Because analytic idealism requires the transcendental reality of mind at large and other minds, and because this transcendental reality cannot possibly be sufficiently substantiated either a priori, since solipsism remains a logical possibility, or a posteriori, since experience affords access only to immanent representations. Eo ipso, analytic idealism must necessarily fail, and must necessarily fail without any possibility of salvation. Analytic idealism cannot retreat to mere claims about empirical reality without abandoning its essential metaphysical commitments, since mind at large and other minds cannot possibly have merely empirical reality without thereby reducing to mere representations in me. And it cannot establish the transcendental reality it requires without inevitably engaging in dogmatism, question-begging, appeals to the stone, reification, and transcendental illusion. Analytic idealism is thus revealed to be necessarily groundless as a philosophical position, groundless not by accident but by necessity, since what it essentially requires cannot possibly be sufficiently substantiated within the bounds of legitimate philosophical inquiry. Precritical metaphysical philosophy is dead, and those still engaging in precritical metaphysics, e.g. Mr. Kastrup, are not allowed even to conjecture, far less to know, anything which lies beyond the bounds of all possible experience, but only to assume, not for speculative use, which they must abandon, but for practical purposes only, the existence of something that is possible and even indispensable for the guidance of the understanding and of the will in life. Doing the sort of pre-critical metaphysics that Mr. Kastrup does, even in light of Kant's critical turn, is as egregiously irresponsible as insisting that Earth is flat even following the Copernican revolution. From all this it follows that it is not in keeping with the nature of philosophy, especially in the field of pure reason, to take pride in a dogmatic procedure, and to deck itself out with the title and insignia of mathematics, to whose ranks it does not belong, though it has every ground to hope for a sisterly union with it. Such pretensions are idle claims which can never be satisfied, and indeed must divert philosophy from its true purpose, namely, to expose the illusions of a reason that forgets its limits, and by sufficiently clarifying our concepts, to recall it from its presumptuous speculative pursuits to modest but thorough self-knowledge. Analytic idealism exemplifies precisely the kind of pretension to absolute knowledge that Kant warns against. Rather than engaging in the crucial philosophical task of exposing the illusions of a reason that forgets its limits, Kastrup's approach represents a regression to exactly those illusions. Rather than accepting the legitimate boundaries of philosophical inquiry and working within them productively, analytic idealism represents an attempt to transgress these boundaries through illegitimate means. The result is not genuine philosophical progress, but rather a regression to pre-critical illusions. Although we had contemplated building a tower which should reach to the heavens, the supply of materials suffices only for a dwelling house, just sufficiently commodious for our business on the level of experience, and just sufficiently high to allow of our overlooking it. All metaphysicians are therefore solemnly and legally suspended from their occupations till they shall have answered in a satisfactory manner the question, how are synthetic cognitions a priori possible? For in this answer alone consists the credential which they must present if they have anything to offer in the name of pure reason. But if they do not possess these credentials, they can expect nothing else of reasonable people who have been deceived so often than to be dismissed without further ado. Kant's insight that we might desire to build a tower which should reach to the heavens, though we possess materials sufficient only for a dwelling house at the level of experience, remains powerfully relevant. Far from representing a mere restriction, this limitation provides the necessary foundation for genuine philosophical progress by establishing clear boundaries for human knowledge and understanding. The present critique of Kastrup's analytic idealism serves as a crucial reminder of these boundaries and the lamentable consequences of attempting to transgress them.